right, hey, this is our podcast.
Hello.
My name's Carla.
I'm Jared.
And we're doing our podcast on kind of a conversation that we've had many times before, but I'm really excited to get back into it with some more sources and such. But yeah, I'm Carla. I'm finishing my 4th year as a microbiology major. Virtually, I'm done with it. I have some more other stuff to do, but I basically have finished with microbiology. And then...
Yeah, and so I'm a senior in computer engineering, and so very different field, but that lends a lot of credibility towards our discussion that we have today. And I'm pretty excited to be here as a special guest and participate in this.
Yeah, so we're going to be talking about talking about ultimately like what is life. In the context of, in biology, there is plenty of room for debate as to whether virus particles are alive or not. And then in the realm of computer technology, there's also some debate as to where the future of things are going, I guess.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's kind of what you see in every science fiction movie or show or book is, rogue AI, very Terminator situation. Skynet goes rogue and decides to kill all humans, or the classic, like, what if AI decides the most optimal way to make a paperclip is to kill all humans? So there's a lot of conversation around AI, especially with things like GPT, like ChatGPT and Bard and Gemini and a lot of these other AI models that are becoming more developed and more advanced, about what life would look like and kind of the ramifications of that if it turns out that, we do accidentally create AGI, or artificial general intelligence.
Cool. I'm excited to learn more about that.
Yeah.
For background on the biological side of it, when you're talking about pathogenic particles or organisms, you essentially look at 3 different categories. So you've got your eukaryotic, your prokaryotic, and then viruses are kind of their own thing altogether. So eukaryotic cells are cells that are like ours. They have a nucleus, they have a bunch of organelles, little inside parts that do jobs for the cell's life. Mm-hmm. And then you've got your prokaryotes, which don't have a nucleus, but they do have still some DNA, some genetic material in there, and they still metabolize their own materials and produce byproducts, and they just kind of keep going. And then you have a virus. A virus, all it is some genetic material encased in a protein shell.
Okay.
That's all you have to be a virus. Some viruses have larger genomes than others. Some have genomes, I can't remember the smallest, but like in the single digits as to number of genes. For reference, a tuberculosis bacteria has about 4,000 genes. And a person, I wish I could remember off the top of my head. It's a lot more than that though. So, tiny little thing. And really, the hallmark area of conversation with this is that it doesn't have any of those organelles. It doesn't have any means to produce its own energy. Its entire prerogative is to enter some other cell and use their parts to replicate its little pieces of molecules of DNA or RNA, which can get all backwards and weird compared with normal things. So that's basically the background, what we're talking about when we talk about viruses.
Okay. I just want to real quick question to clarify for the audience, but also myself. We're constraining this discussion about what is life to around viruses and those kind of particles, and not necessarily about embryos and all that kind of stuff, right?
Yes. Specifically, we're talking about kind of whether an organism is self-sustaining or not, specifically about kind of that ability to do your own metabolism, produce your own energy. Also, it's a great segue because I did want to make a disclaimer. In my parasitology class, actually, my professor was like, "Oh, what's a parasite?" Right? Test question. He's like, "Well, why isn't a fetus a parasite?" And well, his definition is, okay, well, a parasite is something that is eukaryotic and it's a different species than the host. Mm-hmm. But also in parasitology, it's really relevant what stage of life a parasite is in to define what kind of a host it's in. So it's really different when a parasite is like a larva in one host and it's sexually mature in a different host. So for this sake of this conversation, we'll be excluding anything that is not at a stage of life where it should be able to reproduce itself.
Okay. Good. I just wanted to make sure that we're on the same page there. This is not a fetus or abortion question.
Exactly.
Like we're not going that direction at all.
Exactly. Thanks.
Sorry, but you were talking about prokaryotes and eukaryotes, I think is what they were calling them, and how a virus is just genetic information inside a protein capsule.
Exactly. For our purposes, you can kind of think eukaryotic, prokaryotic virus as like big, mini, and micro. Doesn't always work that way, but it's a fine way to think about it for these purposes. So that kind of gets into the question, is a virus alive or not? It's just some molecules of DNA, really, encapsulated in some proteins, and sometimes they have also like a lipid coat around them, but that's really all they are. So I have a few sources, a few pieces of commentary on this question. So number one, this is from a study that was kind of a review over this entire topic. Every single source, like scientific review paper I found about this, starts with the fact that this is a philosophical question. Mm-hmm. And one that scientifically may or may not have a lot of value in answering. However, still interesting discussion. I think one of the main arguments for why a virus wouldn't be alive is because of that difference between it and a bacteria, where it cannot produce its own energy. It cannot do its own metabolism. Which leads to this interesting thing I found called the replicator paradigm. And it says that all biological replicators, so anything that is alive and can reproduce, fall somewhere along the selfishness/cooperativity axis. So parasitic versus beneficial, I guess, or like willing to work together.
Okay.
So viruses typically fall somewhere between the selfish side and in the middle.
So kind of halfway between neutral and selfish.
Yes.
Okay.
Similar to a parasite. A parasite, by definition, must be selfish. And the point in this source, talking about this paradigm, is that as parasites are not excluded from biology, selfish replicators must not necessarily be excluded from biology. This source goes on to cite a paper from 2008 where this parascientist, interestingly, kind of came up with a new paradigm for it, where it's not whether it's alive or not, but maybe there's like a ribosome encoding organism, which is how we normally make our materials, our proteins, and a capsid encoding organism, which is kind of how viruses do it. But nonetheless, they call it an organism. So I didn't go too far down that rabbit hole. That's just one of my sources, but I found that to be interesting.
It is interesting.
Yeah. Do you want to give one of your points and I can kind of bounce back to mine?
Sure. Kind of going off of, what is life, being a philosophical question. It turns out that actually expands to lots of different fields, like in space, what is life in space, right? Like we're looking for any kind of organism really in outer space. Well, the same question could be applied to computers, and like AGI is kind of the big search right now. People want AGI, some people don't want AGI, but what does that actually mean to be alive? Well, there was a professor of mechanical engineering at the University of Nevada, Dr. Eunice Sengal, who wrote about this. He did a whole theory about this, where he proposed a new theory of life because there's difficulty defining what life is. And in his theory, he says that you cannot describe life purely by looking at the characteristics, but need to look deeper. And that when living beings are carefully examined, the characteristics of life appear to be existence, subjectivity, agency, purpose, having a purpose, primacy and supremacy, naturality, field phenomenon, locality, transience, transcendence, simplicity, unicity, initiation, information processing, a set of traits, code of conduct, hierarchy and nesting, and the aptitude to vanish. This is a really long list, but he says that how we define life will impact the future of AI, robotics, and that it's not necessarily a one or two or a list of characteristics, because some life exhibits some of these, some don't exhibit others of these. But they say that life is not an organization of matter, but rather an active agency that can take control of suitable arrangements of matter and direct them towards specific goals. So it's not so much that you are made of matter a certain way or have certain characteristics, but that you're able to exploit other organizations of matter to achieve a purpose. And so something that, so he says the difference between living and non-living entities, therefore, is the presence or lack of this controlling agency of life, this kind of higher, almost higher power. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. Not to interrupt, just to go off of that. That's a really interesting set of characteristics for life. Just because I live in a space where, like most of the life forms that I study, or non-life forms, the entire purpose of their life is just to make more of themselves. Does that fit under that definition?
Yeah, that totally would fit under a purpose. I mean, in a large scope of things, my purpose in life is also to make more of myself.
Fair.
So that would totally fit under this a characteristic, but as he says, it's not necessarily about the characteristics, but more so about the active agency. And so he actually uses the example of a virus for an organism that may or may not be alive. He says that rather than debating whether viruses have enough lifelike properties to qualify as a living thing, we should instead ask whether they show evidence of being controlled by the agency of life. Their ability to hijack cellular machinery and direct it towards viral reproduction suggests they do possess this agency, even if they lack some traditional characteristics of life.
Which is interesting, because even in classes where I think most of my professors are either undecided or actually don't believe that viruses are alive. However, we do talk about viral behavior.
Yes.
Which is interesting.
Yes, exactly. And so viruses don't exhibit some standard characteristics of life, which is why this is a debate.
Right.
However, they do target certain machinery and do certain things.
Yes, the goal is to survive and make more of themselves, just like any other microbe.
Yeah.
Or a lot of organisms.
Yes. And his argument here is that computers will likely, and AGI will likely never achieve life when viewed through this lens, because computers respond purely to inputs and generate an output. They don't necessarily take proactive action to go and act on something, which other sources they have kind of go against and say other things, but we can get to that in a minute as well.
For sure.
And so I don't know, it really does set up that life is kind of a philosophical discussion about what it is, what it's not, what characteristics matter, what don't. Is having an active higher force of agency really the real characteristic we should look at? And will that ever be developed in things like computers or tech or viruses?
Yeah. And it just, I don't know, it just seems like such a small threshold for agency to me.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not saying whether or not I agree with that yet. I'm going to hold my opinion to the end here. I'm going to explore some more of this space and present some more evidence before I come to my own conclusion.
For sure.
But I think this is definitely a good starting point for this discussion.
For sure. Okay, cool. Well, I'll talk about one other source that I have. That if that's good.
Sure. Yeah, go ahead.
That kind of went in on two different microbiologists with opposing opinions on this issue. So for the scientist who believes that it was not alive, first of all, again, the very first thing that they come out with is the question itself is a moot philosophical point. So, I don't know. It's fun.
Good start already.
Saying that all viruses is some gift-wrapped genetic material. And also, I think I've said this, but just to be explicit, genetic material meaning molecules of DNA or RNA in different flip-floppy forms. Virology is crazy. with or without a lipid coat, like I mentioned. One interesting thing is that one discovery that kind of complicated this question was the discovery of some certain giant viruses living inside of amoeba. Amoeba,
I think. I don't know.
Several amoeba.
Many amoeba.
Since these viruses can contain more genes than a simple bacterium and may encode genes for information storage and processing. However, they are still not capable of independent replication. They do not contain the full range of required metabolic processes and rely on host materials. They must use host metabolic replication machinery versus simply needing an environment. Meaning, and again, for those who don't have this background at the tip of their brain.
That's me.
What I mean by machinery is I keep saying, so like in a normal cell, you've got some DNA in a nucleus in a cell, right?
Yeah.
So the DNA, while it's in the nucleus, some proteins will come along and make it into RNA, and the RNA will exit the nucleus, and then the RNA has to pass through a ribosome, and the ribosome makes it into a protein. And those proteins go and do more jobs for the cell. So a virus will enter a cell, and it has to somehow, way or another, all of them have various different mechanisms. They have to, some way or another, get some RNA in a form that is readable by the host cell's ribosome, send it through the host's ribosome to make proteins for itself, to make more capsid proteins so that it can reassemble itself in many, many, many copies.
Okay.
That's what I mean by machinery.
Okay.
I don't know if that
was
needed,
that makes sense.
but
Okay.
anyways. And so, but then, he gets to the end of this, which really describes where he stands. He says, if a virus is alive, should we not also consider a DNA molecule to be alive? And then he asks, what about plasmids, which are just small pieces of circular DNA that can get passed around between bacteria, or prions, aberrantly folded proteins. And that's interesting as well, especially under your characteristics thing, because the DNA molecule, does it technically have a prerogative? If it comes into contact with an RNA polymerase and then comes into contact with a ribosome, it'll replicate itself. Is that a prerogative? Is that agency?
I don't know. That's a good question. I guess going off of the definition of what Dr. Sengal says that it potentially could.
Well, that I can construct in a lab, so.
Yeah, well, you can also construct
That's
life
true,
in a
true.
lab. Anyway,
We'll avoid that
in
part
vitro and all that. Anyways, we'll go past that. For anyone that was born by in vitro, we're not saying that you're not alive.
Yeah, no, not
just
at all.
Disclaimer there. Well, that's very interesting, because I think that is actually a really good aspect that needs to be considered during this debate of what is alive. Is, okay, if we start making the threshold lower for life, then what does that mean for everything else? What about DNA molecules? Are they alive? What about ChatGPT right now? Is it alive? There's something called the Turing test, which Alan Turing, brilliant mathematician, heavily involved in the development of computer science and theory as we know it today. You might know him better from the development of the Enigma machine during World War II, which was responsible for cracking the German Nazi codes so that the Allies would know what they were up to. Brilliant man. Mm-hmm. He developed something called the Turing test, which is that a machine needs to be able to communicate with a human, and the human cannot know that it's a machine, have it be indistinguishable from it being another human they're talking to. And if a computer is able to do that, that's called passing the Turing test. And so recently, ChatGPT 4.0 has passed the Turing test. Some researchers,
Whoa.
Some researchers have replicated this test by asking 500 people to speak with 4 different respondents. They spoke with a human, a 1960s era AI program called Eliza, as well as ChatGPT 3.5 and GPT-4. which was then the newest version of ChatGPT. Now there's some even newer ones, actually. But they said these conversations lasted 5 minutes, after which each participant had to say whether they believed they were talking to a human or an AI. In the study that was published on May 9th, the scientists found that the participants judged ChatGPT 4 to be human 54% of the time. They said that Eliza, which had pre-programmed responses but wasn't run by a large language model, which is what most AI models these days are run on, they said that it was judged to be human only 22% of the time. ChatGPT 3.5 scored 50%, while a human participant scored 67%. I want to first mention that I think it's interesting that the human participant was only recognized 67% of the time.
That is so interesting.
Which speaks volumes for GPT-4 and 3.5. That, is probably the classic, can you distinguish Coke from Pepsi?
Yeah.
And you say yeah, but then you try it, and most people actually can't. 54% of people couldn't distinguish GPT-4 from a human. And so technically it passed the Turing test.
The 67 is also interesting. It kind of speaks to our suspicious nature these days with kind of technology like this.
Yeah. I mean, you get a suspicious phone call. What do you think? Oh, this is a bot. Or you get a random text message online. What are you going to say? Most likely you're not going to think that's a real person.
Yeah. Very interesting.
So under these assumptions, I bring this up for a reason. In Central Michigan University asked one of their philosophy professors about what it would mean if artificial intelligence becomes self-aware, and what that would mean for if it's alive. And so this professor said that one of the questions that was asked was, how can we determine when something has attained what we call consciousness? And I don't really like his answer, but he basically says that people kind of know consciousness just by being around something that's conscious.
I mean, I can see that. Like, who better to judge human consciousness than human consciousness?
True. Yeah, but it's not super analytical or hard definition. It's a very wishy-washy kind of a thing. I mean, but so is what is life? Yeah. But in it, so... Yeah, he kind of says you'll kind of know, but we can kind of use something kind of like the Turing test to kind of see if there's a consciousness. So by his definition, maybe ChatGPT has a consciousness, maybe not. But then kind of going on from that is a series of questions about if assuming that AI is self-aware, is it forced labor to have it do work it doesn't want to do? To what degree is a sense of purpose necessary to be considered alive? Is deleting a self-aware artificial intelligence a form of murder? And such things, which are all interesting questions when you think about what is life. Going back to the virus, if we consider a virus to be alive, is, getting a vaccine promoting the murder of your virus?
I would hope so.
Wait, okay, listen. Opinions at the end. But yeah, so I mean, again, it's just interesting definitions about what is alive and what does that actually mean.
Very much so. Cool. Well, I see we're over time. We'll see if I can cut this down at all at the end. But I'm having a great time, so I'll add my last source just to be unbiased. Yeah. From the scientist who had the opinion that yes, viruses are alive. So he also begins his kind of discussion with the same sentiment. Where we draw the line between chemistry and life can seem a philosophical or even theological argument. So, yeah, I don't know. It's just fun. Yeah. But he kind of goes down the phylogenetic direction. One of the issues with virology and seeing viruses as a life form is that they are not super directly or clearly linked to other known forms of life. Most of the forms of life that we're familiar with can be genetically linked back to ancestors to ancestors to ancestors, including bacteria and archaea and amoeba and parasites. Viruses cannot. However, that is because of the nature of a virus. It's extremely fast replicating and extremely fast evolving. However, there are some links to other organisms, some genetic features common among among virus, insect-infecting virus, bacteria, and extremophile archaea. Potential connection. There's other evidence that has been identified suggesting that viruses most likely originated from RNA-containing cells and split off into a more streamlined existence. And the question you asked there is, did they really cease to be life at this point? If they were originally some RNA in some cell and they just split off, did they then cease to be life? And then the other thing that I've kind of neglected to add, that I will in an effort not to be biased, is that some like to compare viruses to dormant bacteria or like spores, where they shut down their metabolism for a time and like create a hard shell to survive for a long time until they can be reactivated. I don't love this comparison because it's still in there. It's just deactivated. Anyways, but I'll have to include it. And then this scientist goes on to ask, are metabolism and self-sustaining replication even key definitions of life? Or is it the ribosomes, like I was talking about? Or is it membrane-associated metabolic activity, which, for example, if in a plant to do photosynthesis, the molecular processes happen in the membrane of a chloroplast, or with glucose metabolism, large essential portions of it happen in the membrane of a mitochondria. Is that what's required to call it life? And if so, then we would have to include mitochondria and plastids, which I will mention mitochondria. We're familiar with mitochondria.
It's powerhouse
of the cell.
Let's go.
There's evidence that mitochondria used to be a bacteria. And eukaryotic life was born from that entering another cell and becoming symbiotic with it. So, which of these things really makes it alive? That's kind of the question.
That's tricky. I don't have an answer for that.
Yeah, me neither.
Well, I think this has been a fascinating discussion. I think it's only right that we do give our opinions towards, do we think a virus is alive, and do we think that AI will ever achieve life in the future or near future? Would you like to start?
Yeah. I don't know. I'm inclined to think that viruses are not alive.
I'm inclined to agree with you, actually.
Yeah. And this just goes back to my question earlier, is a DNA molecule alive? I really don't think so. I don't think, this is kind of an archaic way of saying it, but the way I've said it before, I'm not sure there's much difference between a virus and like a rock. It's some molecules that just react with other molecules. And I realize that there's fallacies with that, because can I not expand that to prokaryotic or eukaryotic life? Sure. But
yeah,
I'm inclined to think that they're not alive.
I agree. As fun as it is to have the notion of the agency of life being a higher force, that you don't necessarily need the characteristics of life in order to be alive, I think you do. Especially considering, with regards to AI specifically, even following that definition, AI is required to have an input from you in order to do something. In addition to that, it will never be able to respond to a situation that it knows nothing about. So if you put it in a new situation, you give it new things, something has no idea what it is, it will be unable to interpret it.
Even that really crazy, cool, good one.
Yeah, it has no idea what you're talking about. I mean, you could tell it whatever it wants, and sometimes the response is, sorry, I don't know what you're talking about. That's it not knowing what's going on. It gives a default response of, it aired out, default response, here you go. So, but a human, we can say anything to anything. We can take new things that we're given, new inputs, new affordances in our environment, good or bad, and make decisions and react to that. AI is not. If a lightning bolt comes down and strikes my car while I'm in it, if I don't die, I can make some choices. An AI likely has never encountered that. We have not told it to encounter that. Or if we have told it, it will follow what it's told. Otherwise, it will error and do nothing. So I think no, I don't think AI will ever really be alive. I don't really think AGI is a realistic thing, at least in the near future. And I don't think a virus is alive either.
Interesting. I'm inclined to agree with you as well, having listened to all that stuff. From you and from my best friend knows some stuff about this as well. The fact that it can't do anything except what it's given, even if it can learn to apply it really, really well.
Yeah, it still needs to be trained, even then.
Very interesting. Well, realize this has gone over. Again, maybe you'll see what I can edit out, some silences or weird coughs, but...
This has been a great conversation. Thanks for inviting me to be on your podcast.
Of course, and thanks to any listeners for sticking around.
Thanks.
Have a great rest of your day.
Bye.
Bye.